Thank you very much indeed. And just literally just to finish on what was just being said before, part of my work as an independent consultant nurse is I do a lot of reports for the Court of Protection when there are disputes about what is in someone's best interest and there's a care component. And very often when I become involved and you look at all the evidence and you talk to people from everyone's perspectives, I think, and I suppose picking up on what the GP just said, it's when the situation gets to the point where people are thinking, well, this is getting risky, that the person's at home not eating, that they're not, they're not taking their medicines, that they're not allowing caring, and individual professionals know these things but don't talk to the other professionals, is where things start going wrong. And I think, so picking up on what Michael said, it's not the micro questions about, so they haven't got capacity to understand why they need a blood test, but hey, if you can work with them and in their best interest have a blood test and they agree to that blood test at that time, that's not the sort of decision necessarily that would go to the Court of Protection. But when you get to the stage where you see they're losing weight, they're constantly refusing their medicines, and then we've got a social worker over here who actually knows they're refusing care and the care package is breaking down, and the two haven't spoken together, that's when you end up with all sorts of difficulties and all sorts of problems. So I think it is a balance about when does a micro decision become a larger decision. But certainly from the work that I do with Court Protection, the other big problem is when things haven't gone to the Court of Protection. And another case, just to throw at you, for anyone who comes from acute hospitals or works with acute hospitals, that you can publicly Google a case called Esegbona, E-S-E-B-O-N, Esegbona versus King's College Hospital, and that was heard in the Royal Courts of Justice because it was actually a litigation case that I was the expert witness on, and so it doesn't appear as Court Protection, but it has been published and widely read by the legal professions because Mrs. Esegbona was unlawfully deprived of her liberty. In other language, she was falsely imprisoned by King's College Hospital for 7 to 8 months because nobody either applied a dose, listened to what the psychiatrist was saying, listened to what the family was saying, listened to what Mrs. Esegbona herself was saying about wanting to go home. Whether or not had the correct things being done and options been looked at about whether she should go home, whether she would have gone home or not would have been for the Court of Protection to decide. But that case illustrates that hospital's defence was it wouldn't have made any difference anyway. And that judge said, yes, it would, because Mrs. Esegbona would have had a voice. And that is what the Court of Protection gives people who haven't got capacity. It gives them a voice. Whether that voice is accepted or not is for the judge to decide. But that case was published in January this year, and you literally Google it and it comes up. So, moving on, what I'm talking about is safeguarding a rights-based risk assessment process. Now, this fits very much with prevention of the 6 principles of safeguarding. My role when I was still in the NHS was a consultant nurse for safeguarding adults, specialised very much in investigating institutional neglect. And I still do a lot of cases now as an independent person, investigate for the police and coroners, etc., investigating allegations of neglect. Not just in care homes, in hospitals as well. But what are we talking about is positive risk-taking. When does something change from being a risk-taking, positive risk-taking, or when does it become a safeguarding concern? When is it tipped across? When is it tipped across, and when does it suddenly become something that the police should be involved in when there's been an accident, or when is it that actually, well, hey, that person was just having a good time? I am not talking today about the risk assessments and the risk assessment process in respect to things like the temperature of hot water, or the use of bed rails, or stairs in cellars. Only yesterday I had to fly to Scotland on a case that I'm involved in, whereby a woman fell down 13 concrete steps into a cellar, was not found for 5 hours in a care home and died of multiple fractures. I'm not talking about that type of risk assessment today, okay? So we are talking about risk assessment, about everyday life, about risks that we all take. Every single one of you takes these risks all the time. We do, I do, and that we don't necessarily think about it. The risks we're talking about are someone who lacks capacity, living in a care setting, or indeed living at home with a care package, with a care provider that perhaps is risk averse, but particularly people who are now living in care homes. The risks are things like smoking, having the bottle of whiskey in their room. Oh, I don't know if we can do that. They might get themselves drunk. The risk of the person being able to tinker with someone's car or come out and help a care assistant check their oil when you know they've got dementia. Risky? Maybe. But if they've been a mechanic for 60 years, would it be so risky? Would it be so risky? Helping to chop the vegetables, helping to do the activities in the home. These are the risks, these are everyday risks that actually give us purpose in life. These are the risks that I'm talking about. The risks that mean, okay, it might seem a chore. My husband does all the cooking, so I don't have to, at home, I don't have to bother with cooking, but every now and again, I know I'm very lucky, but every now and again, you know, I let him have a weekend off. I'm very generous in that way. And I quite enjoy doing the cooking then. So, it gives me purpose at the weekend, because it stops me, it gets me away from my office and carry on doing more depressing reports. It gives me a purpose. So we do things that give purpose. We do things we want to help someone else. It's within our nature as human beings to want to help. So why does that suddenly disappear just because someone's got dementia and lives in a care home? It doesn't, because it's within us as humans. We want to help. So being able to help, being able to have purpose and a reason to get up in the morning is an inert human need. So why, oh why, do we constantly take it away? Do we deprive people of that human right? Now what is the cornerstone to protect and support people with dementia? Now I've done this presentation in a number of workshops, and in each of those workshops I ask people to actually say, from their professional perspective, what is the cornerstone law to protect and support people with dementia? We've just had a presentation, really excellent, a presentation about the Mental Capacity Act. When I do these workshops, time and time again, that is what people say. It's the Mental Capacity Act, because that's what's been drummed into us. But what I would like to say to you is actually I disagree with you, because the cornerstone, the actual cornerstone law to protect and support people with dementia is the Human Rights Act, because people with dementia are humans. But what do we do? Because it's been drummed into us, Mental Capacity Act, Mental Capacity Act, Mental Capacity Act, that's the one we think of all the time as our starting point. And the starting point, in my view, for everybody, is the Human Rights Act. Because the bottom line is, in this country, unless you're in prison or detained under a DOLS or detained under the Mental Capacity Act or in an immigration detention centre, I can't think of any other examples of where we are not free to do what we want. So if that applies to us, that should be our starting point for people that we support who have dementia, or indeed a learning disability. So everybody, here we are in London, everyone in this room is free to walk out of here now because they're bored, get on a bus and go to Brighton for the day. That's what you want to do, you're free to do it. You might lose your job, you know, I'd be upset, but hey, you are free to do that if you so choose. That right exists to anybody living in the houses out the back who also has dementia. We come back from that point when we're then looking at what risks that person might experience if they have advanced dementia and they too want to get on a bus and go to Brighton. We come back from that point. But the starting point must be they've got just as much right as I have to do what they want with their life. That must be the starting point. And from my experience, that is not our starting point. Our starting point with people who lack capacity with dementia or learning disability, the starting point is exactly the same as, well, we must risk assess because there might be an accident, which is always the starting point when we're risk assessing for the concrete stairs down to the cellar, checking the temperature of the water. So it's become our default position of, goodness me, something terrible might happen. So we'll start from that point and we'll work backwards. And hopefully over the next few minutes, I will help you to think, perhaps, or at least just plant some thoughts in your head that could change that. The most relevant, I keep forgetting I can look here. No good at technology, me, you know. I've got a stick in my neck. Right, the most relevant to dementia and frailty, people with learning disability, is the right to life. Article 2, Article 3, which prohibits inhumane or degrading treatment. Now, as an expert witness doing litigation cases, I'm seeing these coming up more and more when families are suing care providers and hospitals about the care. So we talk about it in the language of neglect. The Human Rights Act calls it inhumane and degrading treatment, which actually said, you know, when I was in the NHS and I would talk about the word neglect, I was actually told by the Director of Nursing when I was talking about one of our hospital wards that had neglected people, and she banged on the table and told me I was not allowed to use that word. And I said, it's not my word, actually. It's not the law, not the world according to Lynne Phair. This is the world according to No Secrets, as it was then. So just imagine if you start sitting there in your case conference and start saying, well, actually, this treatment's been inhumane and degrading. It'd be World War III, using language like that. But that is what we're talking about. We wouldn't accept it. So why should we accept it? The right to liberty and security. And of course, that's where the doles fits. It's because we all have the right to liberty. The right to private and family life. Which is also very important, and when we get situations whereby people are being, some care homes perhaps have got relatives who perhaps are unique in their way that they attend their relatives and cause difficulties, and you think about stopping them visiting. You need to be thinking, can I? So is their behaviour so bad that it means that it's putting that person's care at risk? It's putting their placement at risk. I've recently been working on a case where the care home got to the point where they actually gave the person notice to quit, the resident notice to quit, because of the behaviour of the relative. And I'm not saying that in any critical way of the nursing home, because I've looked at what's going on. But that was the point they got to, and it was because the relative actually caused this person to lose their placement. So is it that when you get to that situation you should be taking legal advice? Because if you don't, you could be charged with Article 8 problems. And then the freedom for discrimination, including on the grounds of disability. And this is another interesting one, because how many of us who work with people with dementia actually really think that the Equality Act 2010 really applies to people with dementia? The Act, we think of it applying to people with a learning disability now. We think of it applying to people, you know, with physical disabilities. We know about it in employment. When you employ staff, you know that you have to make sure that if they're pregnant or they've got dyslexia or they've got this or got that. We know about it. Do we actually really think about it in respect of the people that live in our care settings or that we offer a service to who have dementia? Because it is covered by the Equality Act. And a very good practical example of this is in respect of, in care, I'm just using care because it's an example, is signage. Now, signage. Now, there's the thing. You can have a sign on the toilet. You know, you might even have a multi-queuing sign with a picture and the words on the toilet. The best, poshest nursing home in the world will have a nice sign there. But your residents are sitting in the lounge. They've got dementia. They can't remember that the toilet's up that corridor. But we don't have signs in the lounge to say, go this way to the toilet, because we don't like signs, because it makes it look like an institution. Because every time the local authority come in, the contract monitoring or CQC come in, they're saying this looks like an institution, you've got signs everywhere. Don't they? Now, they go into the toilets and they say, well, these toilets aren't very good, they haven't got grab rails for people that need assistance. They haven't got raised toilet seats to take care of people who can't bend down properly. These toilets aren't suitable for people with a disability. And you think, hang on a minute, let's just think about this for a second. Because, I hope you're still with me here, because putting signs up in the lounge, if you're sitting in the lounge and you can't remember to go up there and turn left and go along that corridor to the toilet, and the reason you can't remember is because you have dementia. You have a disability. You have a problem with your declarative memory and your ability for your brain to hold on to new information. Why is that any different to the fact that this person's got a problem with their legs that won't hold their weight because their muscles are failing? I can't see there's a difference in terms of what you have to do. By law, under the Equality Act, what you have to do is put things in place to try and help that person be as independent as possible. So we put our grab rails in and we put our raised toilet seat in the toilet for people with a physical disability. So why are we not being brave enough and confident enough to say to those that don't like signs, that could be done properly, I might add, that actually this sign in the lounge telling people the toilet this way is actually to ensure that we comply with the Equality Act, because our residents have a disability. Why? Because we, and I include me in this historic, up until the last few years, we don't think about this legislation applying to everybody that we might look after. Now, the Dementia Action Alliance, they've come up with dementia statements, and we've got a copy of these in your pack, so I won't read them all, but they have actually started saying, we demand that we are respected under the Equality Act alongside everyone else. And these statements are very clear. If these have been brought out by people from other disability action groups, we wouldn't be thinking anything of them. But these are all new. These are all things that people with dementia in the Dementia Action Alliance are saying. And they are becoming a force to be reckoned with now. They are starting to say, listen to us. We have a condition, but we are still human beings. We have a right under the Equality Act, and we have rights under the Human Rights Act. So where does this take us? This takes us, I hope, along a bit of a journey now that's actually starting to say, hang on a minute then, we need to be thinking about the people that we support differently, because we're putting those people into our world, because we are covered by all those legislations and they are too. So then we start talking specifically about risk assessment. How many here, just a show of hands, how many here are aware and have read the Department of Health guidance, nothing ventured, nothing gained, for people with dementia? Don't be ashamed, none of you have, and that's exactly what has happened every time I've done this workshop. So that's now about 300 people, no one's ever heard of it. Came out in 2011, and it's designed to help enable positive risk-taking. It amazes me, I don't know what the answer is, how we can have guidance come out, and yet people working in the workforce with people with dementia and others with cognitive impairment, we just don't seem to have but the Department of Health haven't found a way of getting the right documents so that people know that they're there. But this document has been out since 2011, it's very helpful, and it talks about how a risk-enabled framework, about understanding the person's needs and looking at the impact of those risks on the person, enabling and managing the risk and risk planning. Now, those of you that do a lot of risk assessment, you probably say, well, that doesn't really sound an awful lot different to what you do anyway. But we have got a problem with health and safety. We have got a problem about how we do risk assessments. Hopefully you would agree to some extent. And I think what we also have got is an inert belief that actually, oh, we can't do that because of health and safety. It's the pat response. And yet the guidance that came out from the Health and Safety Executive in 2014, which hopefully all of you that work in care homes will have a copy of and will be fully conversant with, which is the Health and Safety in Care Homes guidance, they say in 1.4 in their opening gambit, the core elements that are required to help you manage for health and safety are good leadership and management, a trained and skilled workforce, and an environment where people are consulted and feel involved. Now, in my book, that fits with all of those standards that we just looked at with the Dementia Alliance. And what they also go on to say in 1.16, making sensible risk assessment decisions. This is the Health and Safety Executive Guidance. When considering the care needs of an individual, everyday activities are often identified that will benefit their lives, but also put them at some level of risk. This requires a balanced decision to be made between the needs, freedom and dignity of the individual and their safety, with the aim of enabling residents to live fulfilled lives safely, rather than providing reasons for restricting them. So the Health and Safety Executive themselves in 2014 are saying, come on, let's start to get real here about enabling people to take ordinary risks. So this guidance came out, which again, not many people have come across. And they talk about, Department of Health talk about starting with the person's hopes, needs and aspirations. What are their interests? What do they want to do? How can they feel fulfilled? What will make them feel it's worth getting up in the morning? Just the same as you and me. Then think about the key risks for the person, for them and for others. And think about the impact of that risk. And then put in your management plan. And I will give a couple of examples of this in a little while. Now, the Royal College of Nursing have also brought out some guidance. Again, I doubt anyone here has ever come across it. 3 steps to positive practice in the Royal College of Nursing. No, don't worry, you're not alone. Not many people have either. Now, this guidance has come out specifically focusing on the use of restrictive practice. So it was brought out because of the problems of where there's been some really appalling restraint in some places going on, and it's about the drive to reduce the amount of restrictive practice. So again, people working with dementia, people working with those with dementia and a learning disability, this is something we need to be thinking about as well. How do we not stop using restraint and restrictive practice? But their guidance actually talks about some very useful things to do with risk assessment that are more broad. Now, although it's brought out by the Royal College of Nursing, it is an open document that anybody can download. You just Google it and you can download it. It's not just for registered nurses. And what they talk about is, as part of their approach, is part of their approach to reducing the need for restrictive practice is the freedom, which I feel is very important when we're thinking about rights-based risk assessment. Fairness, that the person has access to fair processes and getting their views across. Listening to the person with dementia. Respect, that the person is valued as an individual, is listened to, and what is important to them is considered. If it's important to that person to help go out and check the oil of that care assistant's car, that's what will make them feel that they've done something to help somebody. We need to be thinking about these things, of how will that help them to feel that they've actually made a contribution to the world that they live in. Equality, that there is no discrimination. Well, they can't do that because they've got dementia. That is discrimination. Because that is no different from saying they can't do that because they're Spanish, or they're not allowed to do that because they're Welsh, or it's no different, is it? But we would classify that as discrimination. So simply saying they can't do that because they've got dementia is discrimination. Now, it might be that you identify it's not safe for Michael to get on the bus and go to Brighton for the day because he doesn't know, he can't remember the bus numbers, he doesn't know where he is, he hasn't got any money, da-da-da-da-da-da. And all of those things are because he's got dementia. But we've not gone to that to start with. We arrive at, actually, the reason he can't do all of these things, and those risks are so great, is because of the dementia, not the other way around. Which, of course, is also fits with the Mental Capacity Act, your assessment process, and the causative nexus, as it is called. Dignity, treating the person with compassion, I've missed out a U, sorry, that values them as a fellow human being. So obvious. And yet, do you, as good leaders, as good managers, when we're coming back to what the Health and Safety Executive, good leadership and management, are we ensuring that everybody understands these things, that we don't teach dignity and respect in Unit 3 of whatever it is, care certificate or whatever it happens to be, that actually these things run as golden threads through every single thing you do, whether it is manual handling, whether it is dignity and respect, whether it is risk assessment. And autonomy, that the person is able to exercise the maximum amount of choice and control as possible. So it might be that what we have to do is Michael's determined to go to Brighton on the bus, so it might be that we actually find a volunteer who can help Michael go on the bus and go with him. Those sorts of things. These are all things about how we risk assess. Now, I'll just tell you quickly about the man who fell in the garden. It's a true story in one of the care homes that I'm a professional advisor for. He was a gentleman who lived in his care home, lived with dementia, and ambulant, walking about. He used to be an engineer at a large factory, and he was also the fire warden. So he would, in the care home, he was forever making sure that the fire extinguishers worked and move the fire extinguishers. And he would go into meetings, so he would walk into somewhere like this now and say, right, doing a fire drill. So all the staff would get up, they'd go out from where they were, and they say, thanks very much, Bill, we'll take over now. So, and Bill would go out and walk around the garden. The garden was well lit. It had a flat pavement, had lots of interesting things. You could go out one door, come in the other. The doors were always open. But they did used to lock them late at night. They used to lock them about 9 o'clock-ish, just because there's only 2 or 3 staff on, and it was just and for security, because of people, coming in from outside, like you lock your own front door at night at home. Not for any other reason. Anyway, Bill was carrying on as he always did in his bed. He went to bed, and he always used to go to bed early, and he went to bed, and they went and saw him. He was in bed fast asleep at 9:15 at night. No problem. About 10 o'clock, they went down that end corridor again for something else, and they saw his door was open, and Bill wasn't in his bed, and they saw the fire door was open, and they saw that the fire panel thing, that's the best technical description I can give of it, was disconnected. Bill's an engineer, remember. It was disconnected. They went outside, and Bill was laying on the pavement, in the garden. He'd fallen over and broke his hip. And he went to hospital and he died 3 days later. So they did all the reports, and as you do, sign CQC, and then the manager and the senior manager, well, is this a safeguarding? Well, I don't know that it is a safeguarding. And they had a debate. No, I don't think it's a safeguarding. We'll phone local authority. Phone local authority, is a safeguarding. Social worker, no, don't think it's a safeguarding. No, I agree with you. I think it's a sad accident. He was, he was doing what he did, albeit unscrewing fire thingies outside. Anyway, so that was that. 2 days later, they got a phone call from a social work manager. This is a safeguarding. We're coming in. Why is it safeguarding? The reason it's safeguarding, because he was outside in the garden at 9:30 at night, and he shouldn't have been allowed to. Well, A, he opened the fire door, but B, why couldn't he be in the garden at 9:30 at night? The garden was lit, it had good lighting. We checked all the lux lights, and it was flat. And why? Well, because he's got dementia, says this social work manager. At which point, the senior manager lost it a bit and said, so, have you got a garden? Yes, I've got a garden, says this social worker. Do you ever go and sit in your garden at night with a glass of wine? In the summertime? Yes. So why is it you're allowed to do that? And yet Bill was not supposed to be in the garden at 9:30 at night just because he'd got dementia. Isn't that discrimination? Anyway, in the end, they accepted that this was not a safeguarding matter. No one had neglected him, and it was a very sad accident that actually it couldn't have been foreseen. It couldn't have been foreseen. But the essence of the story is that the default position was, well, it must be a safeguard, it must be neglect, because he'd got dementia. So we've got to think about the person's rights and respect that will be upheld. We must promote independence and dignity and respect, and we must empower staff to demonstrate how risks can be assessed and managed in the best interest of the person. And one of the big fears I know for people who work in care homes is the big feeling of being not valued and respected as equal professionals alongside their health or social work colleagues. And that feeling that I'm told, and I've witnessed when I work alongside nursing home colleagues, that whatever they say, if you're a district nurse or a social worker or someone from health or social services, they know best. They come in with, we know best. So for anyone working in care homes, start having more confidence and start thinking, actually, how can I articulate why this was the right thing? And for those working in health and social services, just try and start thinking that actually these are equal level professionals that are working in partnership, and listen to what they have to say. So we've got to think about the rights-enabled activity. Now this is where we're just coming round to now giving you some examples of all of that gallop of things that I've taken you through. How do we do a rights-enabled activity? First of all, we've got to think about who the person is and who the person was. What were their interests? What were their loves? How did they feel that they were useful in society or in their family in the past? And what can they do now? Observe their behaviour and when it occurs and what it occurs. What are they doing? A lady that I was observing last year with some work that I was doing, and she sat constantly folding. Anything she could find, she folded. So when I phoned her daughter, and they said, oh, she worked in a factory. What did she do in that factory? No one knew in the care home, so I phoned her daughter. She was in the packaging department of a foam factory. This is in the Midlands. What she was doing was finding things to pack. Now this lady expressed a lot of distress and disturb her. She would get up, she would pace, she'd pick things up, she'd interfere with other people. So we found some things for her and asked her if she could help us pack them. Got some brown paper, got some blocks, got some boxes, and we asked if she would help us pack these things. I'm digressing a bit here, but it gave her purpose. She was helping us, and she stopped interfering with other people. So it's understanding someone's behaviour. What is it that they're doing? Finding purpose in the activity, a little example I gave you there. Think about the person's strengths. How often do we still focus on their deficits? What are their strengths? And those strengths might be huge, those strengths might be very small. I was in Canada last year, and they, in a care home, using an approach that I've been studying, Montessori approaches for people with dementia, and all this person could do, he sat there, he was always telling jokes. He couldn't walk, his memory was, you know, to put it bluntly, shot to bits. He didn't know where he was, didn't know what he was doing, but he could chat and he could tell jokes. So his job, he could still read. So the staff, out of a joke book, chose 3 or 4 jokes, and they'd say, "Joe, what's the joke of the day?" And Joe's role was to, at lunchtime, read out the joke of the day. And it gave him great pride. And then someone would write the joke of the day on the blackboard. Joe's joke of the day. Now, because Joe couldn't remember, because his memory was so poor, he lived that all day, because it was, oh, my joke of the day, have you heard my joke of the day? Every 10 minutes, have you heard my joke of the day? But it gave him purpose. There was no risk associated with that, but that was his strength. So we have to consider the risks, but we also have to consider the staff's anxieties, fears and defensive culture. How often, when we're thinking about risk assessment, do we have another column which is, and what are the staff's fears? About being criticised, by safeguarding, about trying to justify it to CQC. I'll get the sack. What will the family say? I'm too scared. What if they hurt themselves? I'll never forgive myself. We have to acknowledge that we all have, as humans, have fears, some of which are ingrained in us, actually, professionally. But how often do we see that in a risk assessment? We don't, and I think it's time we did. Start thinking, so what are the fears for us? And then we think about doing a risk-enabled care plan. Now I've got a couple of, you have to tell me if I'm time on.
A couple of minutes.
Right, so a couple of examples now of risk-enabled positive risk-taking. And these are, one is from a case in Canada, where I was out there learning last year about how they're using this approach. The other one is from the care home group that I'm working with in the Midlands. And I call it Bert because that was my dad's name. So Bert, but the thing is true, I've just used my dad's information. So Bert was a car mechanic and now lives with dementia, so that was his past and present. It's a summary, you would put in more detail, I hasten. It was observed that he fiddles with other people's things, goes into their rooms and tries to take equipment apart. Staff thought a good activity for Bert would be to have a car which was disabled and put in the garden, and Bert would be asked if he could help to fix it. Additionally, and for bad weather, parts of an engine which had been cleaned could be set up with the relevant tools in an area in the care home setting for him to repair. So then we looked at the strengths of Bert. He had preserved procedural memory, and I think we often don't think about the difference between procedural and declarative memory. It's really something that is there, it's out there in the literature, but we don't use it enough. We don't think about it enough. His procedural memory enabled him to recognise familiar tools. He'd been a mechanic since he was 14. He had knowledge of a car engine and still telling staff how to change the oil. He had no history of violence or aggression or responsive behaviours towards other people, no mobility problems. His walking was average for a man of his age. He was 85. He'd been using tools since he was 15. He'd worked in a cold garage for 50 years, and he was unable to recognise that a car engine had been disabled, because that's a strength, remember. Because, you know, if you're taking the spark plugs out, it'd be quite, because you don't really want him driving it on. And vital parts have been removed. And he is a kind man and enjoys helping people. That is a strength of character. How often do we think of things like that as strengths? The risks to be considered was that Bert might try and hit someone with one of the tools. He might hurt himself with one of the tools. You can hear staff saying these now, can't you? He could throw the parts of the engine that would hurt another person. He might fall over in the garden. He could get hypothermia if he goes outside when it's cold. However, we identified that there was no law stating that it was against the law for a man with dementia to be given tools and work on a car engine. So we looked at how this could be used to his benefit, and we looked at a risk-enabled care plan. So the care plan for the garden, so in health and safety parlance, the care plan with control measures, the engine and car was disabled, the bonnet was fixed in the up position so it wouldn't fall and chop his head off or crush his hand. The only tools that were suitable for certain jobs were left available. Any corrosive or dangerous parts were removed from the engine, and Bert was invited to dress warmly when outside and was offered thermal overalls. Remember, he'd worn those for 50 years. The risk-enabled care for the engine part in the building was that the area was set away from the main sitting area where he was able to enjoy and do the repairs. The engine part had been pressure cleaned and made safe. Only a specific part of the engine would be left out, for example, a head gasket, whatever one of them is. Tools would be left for that particular engine part, and cue cards would be written asking Bert to help fix the head gasket. Happy as Larry, Bert was, in there all day. The other example, Ivy, a volunteer cook. This is me mum. True facts, but was used differently for another lady. Ivy was a maths teacher, but she also did a lot of catering for volunteer groups at the Gliding Club and also her beloved Scout group. Ivy was demonstrating she was unhappy and possibly bored by resisting care, shouting and hitting staff and sitting, rocking and tapping. They thought Ivy could be invited to help prepare vegetables for the care home midday meal because she'd done catering. Her strengths were she'd done large-scale catering as a hobby for 64 years. She had preserved procedural memory to use a knife and chop vegetables. She demonstrated her ability to use a knife because she uses a knife to eat her dinner with. Ivy had always offered herself as a volunteer and enjoys helping others. From the past, we knew that. She was jovial and chatty and was good company when she is positively engaged. She was still able to recognise and handle vegetables, and she could sit with others for periods of time without getting agitated and chop the vegetables. The risks that were considered was that she might cut herself with a knife, attack others with a knife, cause a hygiene problem in the main kitchen, cause the home to breach the basic food hygiene certificate rules, cause a risk of cross-infection by handling food that others will eat. So the risk-enabled care plan, with the control measures in old language, is that this. Ivy should be invited to join with others in the dining room and chop vegetables, removing the need to enter the main kitchen. Hand hygiene would be offered before food preparation begins. Blue gloves would be offered if any food is to remain uncooked after it's prepared. But this would be assessed after Ivy had only been asked to prepare food that would be cooked. She will initially be asked, so no laws identify stating that a person with dementia is not allowed to handle or cut vegetables. Environmental health confirmed that as Ivy did not need to hold a basic food hygiene certificate to prepare vegetables because she was under supervision of someone who did, and it was someone from the kitchen who became involved in this activity. Staff identified that there was no history of Ivy being violent, there was no history of cutting herself with the knife she uses to eat with, or that she didn't know what to do with that knife. There was enough staff there to oversee everybody. There were special vegetable knives with easy grip handles and chopping boards that were separate to what was used in the main kitchen. The activity was failure-free and vegetables were thoroughly washed by the chef before they were cooked. She used a kitchen knife that she'd been using for 80 years. Risk-enabled. So you're still assessing the risks, but you're doing it from a how can we rather than a we can't. So rights-based safeguarding, it's not simply the incident or accident that should be considered as an indication of neglect or harm. A sad accident may be the outcome of a very positive, fulfilling and engaging activity. That does not make it neglect or abuse. How the risks and benefits have been assessed or failed, that is the crucial factor. in my opinion, as to whether something is safeguarding. Thank you very much.